Hey everybody, welcome to myboardgameguides.com. My name is Chris, and today I will guide you through the strategy do's and don'ts when it comes to playing Power Grid. Alright, so this is the board setup for Power Grid, and we're looking at the German version. I've gone ahead and placed cities and bought some power plants for our initial 4 players: green, yellow, red, and blue. But before we start and get into more detail, I just wanted to say that Power Grid is one of my favorite board games because it's accessible to new players, but there's also a lot of decisions to be made. And I realize that a lot of the decisions to be made can be pretty overwhelming. So I wanted to create this video to give new players, at least, a guide on the do's and don'ts to playing Power Grid, so that even if you don't win, you'll be able to compete pretty strongly. So let's get to it. The do's and don'ts for Power Grid. Do pay attention to what resources are in high demand. So I've gone ahead and purchased some power plants for each player. So green has 1 oil plant. Then you have yellow with a coal plant. You have red with a hybrid coal/oil plant. And you have blue with a coal plant that can power more cities. And because just from looking at this, you can see that coal is going to be in pretty high demand. And depending on where you are in the turn order, that might influence how many resources you buy. So if you think coal is going to be really expensive as the game goes on, you might decide to just stock up a little bit more on coal to get it when it's cheap versus when it's expensive. So because yellow is going to be first in purchasing coal, and he has a plant that can store up to 4 coal, he might just decide to buy all the coal from the 1 and the 2 stack. Now, the other thing to keep in mind when you're deciding how many of the resources to buy is also look at the refill rate, which is shown on this sheet. So we're playing a 4-player game, and you can see that coal refills at 5 pieces. There's 3 oil that gets replenished. There's 2 garbage that get replenished. And there's 1 uranium that gets replenished. So keep that in mind, because the demand for a certain resource should be kept in mind, but also think about the refill rate too, because some resources that aren't in high demand might become really cheap, and that's when you'll want to buy a different power plant, which will hopefully be less expensive overall to maintain in terms of the resource requirement. So that's the first one. Do pay attention to what resources are in high demand. So, in addition to that, the game's winning condition means you have to power the most cities after, in a 4-player game, somebody has built 17 cities. So when I say capacity, I mean power plant capacity. So let me take you to some examples of power plant sets, which can total up to 17. So here in the top row, you have someone with a 5 nuclear, a 5 coal, and 7 garbage. And below, you have somebody with 2 coal that can power 6 cities. You have 1 oil that can power 5 cities, and somebody with a nuclear plant that can power 6 cities. Both players are capable of powering 17 cities, and chances are, if you can power 17 cities when the endgame condition of 17 cities is built, you have a pretty good chance of winning. Now, sometimes you'll want an insurance policy where you can power an additional one just in case somebody tries to get the jump on you. But overall, if you expect to win this game, you will have to figure out how to power the most possible. And generally, the safest option is to get a power plant combination that can at least power up to the number of cities required for you to win. So that is tip number 2. Do keep the capacity in mind, because capacity is the king in the end game, and get 3 plants that will power at least 17 cities for 4 players, 15 cities for 5 players, and I don't remember what it is exactly for 6 players. All right. In addition to that, you also have another thing that you should do is see which power plants are coming up and buy accordingly, since you'll want the most efficient plants possible. So here, I've set up the market for power plants. You can see that 3 was bypassed. You see there's 2 green plants coming up. You see that there's a nuclear plant that's getting out there, and a power plant that requires hybrid coal oil. It can power 4 cities. Well, depending on where you are in the auction order, you might decide that it's better to skip out and try to wait for better plans to show up. So let me just shuffle the order a little bit. So let's say instead this is how the power plant situation looks in terms of the futures market and the current market. And let's say there's a pretty good chance that the 20 power plant will come up. Well, if you can somehow avoid purchasing any of the ones in the top row and let other people, or bait other people into purchasing at least 2 or at least 3 2 power plants to get the 20 over to the top row, it would be beneficial for you to do so, because the 20 plant with its 5 capacity is pretty much an end game plant, one that you will want to have at the very end of the game to hit your capacity goal of 17 or more. So if you can somehow look and see what power plants are coming up and see if there's any really desirable plants in the pipeline for you to buy, recommendation is to save your money and target the plants that are in high demand. So this tip, do keep in mind which power plants are coming up in their order and buy accordingly. Now, sometimes things don't come according to plan, so be flexible in your response. Okay, our next tip, do pay attention to turn order. Infamous turn order, because that influences so much in Power Grid. The earlier you are in turn order, the first dibs you'll get on bidding on power plants, which you may or may not want, but you'll be last in buying cities and buying resources. So these resources down here will be much more expensive than you might prefer. And likewise, if you are last to build cities, there's a chance you could be cut off, and that's not something you want either. So pay attention to turn order. And the last tip that you should definitely think about when you're playing is track which cities are high priority and which ones aren't, because sometimes you'll know that there will be people gunning for certain cities that you want to beat them to, and and you have to understand that because with cheaper cities, there might be cheaper cities that are completely safe for you. You can expand into them anytime, but there's also other cities that are much more important so that you can make sure you're not being blocked off. So let's look at a couple examples. So on this part of the board, you'll notice that yellow is hold up in the northern areas, and green is just slightly below. And what does that mean exactly? Well, it means that when it's yellow's turn to buy cities, instead of just going up and getting Flensburg all the way up here, you should think about going to Lübeck and Hamburg, because green has an excellent opportunity to just move into this area and shut yellow out completely. And if that happens, yellow is going to have some really expensive efforts needed to expand his base. And I've seen games where players were just completely trapped by where they are simply because they didn't realize that certain cities are really valuable and that if they get blocked off, there's no way they can expand. Similarly, if you look over on the west side of Germany, Munster and Dortmund are going to be probably high priorities for Red. Red will want to move down here so that he can access the cheaper areas all the way in Dusseldorf and Köln and Aachen. And Blue will also try to do the same thing, except expand into Munster to keep Red out, and also take Dortmund while he's at it, because Dortmund's also pretty cheap. So that's this tip that you should keep in mind. Do see which cities are high priority and which aren't, because people will be gunning for some cities, and if they manage to trap you in there, you're not going to have a good chance of winning. So, with all those do's, why don't we move over to the don't? Stuff you shouldn't do when you're playing Power Grid. So, the first mistake that I see a lot of people making is buying too many power plants. Now, the first couple of power plants can look kind of cheap, but when you get to power plants like, say, these down here, these are huge capital expenditures, huge investments, basically. And you know that because of this game's bidding mechanic, these prices are going to be really, really high. So the 42 plant could go up all the way to 60 or 70. I've seen games where a power plant was auctioned off for $80, and those prices are ludicrous. And if you spent too much of your money buying power plants that only get used once or twice during the game, that doesn't help you a whole lot. You should definitely avoid buying too many power plants. And if I were to give like a good benchmark, I would say build no more than 5 power plants. 4 if you absolutely can afford it, but that's much harder to do because you basically need to have at least your second or third power plant be a end game power plant. So any power plant with a capacity of 5 or more. But if you can keep it down to 5, then you're in a pretty good spot to win. Any more than 5, and you just might be wasting resources and income where you might not need to. In addition to that, mistakes new players make: don't overpay for green power plants. Yes, they're free in terms of the resources you have to buy. But here's the thing: green plants means that they will keep you from competing in the resource market. And why is that bad? Well, the more green power plants are out on the board, the cheaper resources are on the whole. So you're basically helping other people get a discount on their resources because you're not competing for the resources that they might be competing for. In addition to that, let's wait for this to focus a little bit. There we go. Green power plants can also be bid up for high prices more than they need to. So if you see people getting into a bidding war for green power plants, don't join in. Just stay out. Just get good old power plants that require resources for a reasonable price and move on. Don't engage in price wars for green power plants, at least in the beginning. Now, when it comes to the end game, sure, there's going to be some bidding wars for these really awesome power plants. But again, for those, just don't overpay for them and know when to get out. So, again, don't overpay for green power plants. So earlier, I talked about the whole turn order business because that just becomes important. The later you go in the turn order, that means the earlier you'll go in terms of city building and resource purchases. And if you overexpand, you may find yourself paying a high cost for resources. So let me do an example. Let's say our erstwhile player, Blue, has decided to build 2 cities on the first round. Let's assume that was possible. In Munster and Dortmund. Well, he now has 4 cities on the board, which is great, I guess. Except he can only power 2 of them. He can only power 2 cities. And that will push him up to 4 cities, and which will make him first in terms of the auction, but last in terms of buying resources. And if you're last in buying resources, that gives other players an opportunity to screw you. It allows them to build where you might not be to block you off, and that would really hamper your growth efforts. So really keep in mind, don't overexpand, otherwise you will be pretty severely crippled because, yeah, everything will be more expensive and you might not be able to get out of where you want to go. So don't overexpand. Also, don't rely on one power plant type. Now remember when I discussed about having, say, between looking at supply and demand for resources, let's say this is where we were for this as an example. So here we have Blue, who has 2 power plants, but each one requires 3 coal for a total of 6 coal a turn. That is much higher than the coal refill rate. And if you find yourself stacking power plants that require the same type of resource and a lot of it, and other people are doing the same thing as well, that resource is going to get pretty rare pretty quickly. Things will get expensive, and there's the opportunity to deny people resources, meaning buy enough of these resources so that a player won't be able to power the power plants necessary. So try to keep your power plants diverse And don't rely on just one type of power plant. Finally, the last mistake that I see a lot of players making is with the resources. Now if you look at the resources on your power plants, you can store up to double what is shown on the card. So for this 8 coal plant, you can store 6 coal. But here's the thing. It is tempting to buy as much coal as you need to stock up the power plant. However, if you do so, make sure it doesn't cost you a city. City building in this game is everything. It is how you win the game. It dictates how much money you can potentially get from your power plants, so you generally want to maximize your revenue as possible. And if you find yourself falling short of your capacity, so let's look at Blue. His capacity right now is 7 cities. And let's say he can only power 6 of them. That's 1 city that is just ignored over the top. Doesn't matter. And that's kind of like a loss of potential revenue. What you want to do is make sure that when you buy resources that you can power at least your capacity, because that will be the most efficient play and will reward you in the long run as you race towards the end. Because maximizing your revenue in this game is everything. It will give you the resources to fight all the bidding wars that you might get into later on, and it will definitely bring you closer to the end game, because instead of spending money on resources, you're spending money on building cities, which will ultimately help you win. So that's it, folks. Those are my 5 do's and 5 don'ts for Power Grid. Subscribe below if you really enjoy these videos. I hope you'll see you again next time, and hopefully this video will have been really helpful in that you can start winning more of your games of Power Grid. Alright, so long folks. Bye-bye.